Okay, so I'm just going to give a quick 5-minute talk, and then we're just going to have a panel discussion between us that's going to be, I think, a whole lot of fun, hopefully, here. I think first thing is to address, I'm not sure how the title of this talk came to be. I'm Steve Newcomb. I work for ZK Sync, and we are a Layer 2 solution, and Layer 2s are super cool.
Layer 2s are definitely cool.
Layer 2s are definitely cool. And Layer 3s are just part of what we're going to be doing in the future. So I just definitely want to throw props to Layer 2. None of us agree that Layer 2s are not cool. So one of the things that we just wanted to do is try to maybe help cast a high-level abstract picture of what I would call 10x moments. So when technologies that are built to really affect billions of people, it's really the 10x moments where you see a ripple effect in the ecosystem that everyone should pay attention to, where you see the number of use cases and the number of users have like a 100x response to those 10x moments. And we've seen this in the past with the internet. So imagine 1995, average internet speed was 10 kilobits about. We had 25,000 websites. And then every time you see a 10x moment in increases in speed or decreases in cost or increases in ease of use or just simply trust. So in 1995, remember, like none of us trusted our credit cards on the internet. The internet was criminals. It was a fad. It was going to go away. Fast forward to 2005. Average internet speed is sitting around 1 megabit at that point. And that's when I was back building a search engine company that ultimately became this thing called Microsoft Bing, which I do not use. I use Google. And I remember indexing the web back then because I'll never forget the number of websites we had to index to be legitimate, and the number is 60 billion websites. And that's because we got things like jQuery and JavaScript, and we got things like WordPress that made things easier, faster, cheaper. We got SSL, and we got that little lock icon up on the browser that made us feel like we could use our credit cards up there. So where are we in crypto right now? I'd say we're kind of at that moment where we have only a few ecosystem projects compared to what we'll see in 10 years. And nobody trusts crypto right now because of all the stuff that's happening in the early phases of disruptive technology. And I just wanted to try to really capture, and I love this tree of life slide. I tried to make it as organic as possible. And just talk about where are the 10x moments that are coming our way. So they're coming in all layers, layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3. The next big 10x moment in layer 1 is EIP 4844. The next big moment in layer 2 is just the existence of layer 2. So you'll have ZK rollups and optimistic rollups providing both about a 10x bump and making it faster and cheaper to use Ethereum without degrading its security and without degrading its decentralization. But what's going to happen in the poorly named layer 3, which I think we all agree is a poor name for it, is you're going to see a star cluster of 10x moments. So you're going to see customization go through the roof. You're going to see scale go through the roof. You're going to see costs get reduced. You're going to see options like the ability to tokenize your own fractal chain up there happen. And you're going to see options like privacy happen, which is, I know, a big topic of late. And I just really wanted to say that, and I'm noticing this is an old slide deck. I had promised not to shill ZK, and I see the old name still sitting there. And I want to stress that layer 3 is valid for both ZK rollups and optimistic rollups. So we're here trying to be in unison to just educate. This audience is looking for things like, what are the 10x moments where I might want to invest? Where are the 10x moments where I think there's going to get many, many more use cases and many more users coming there, so this can finally be something that is mass market. And I think I'll leave it there and let us just discuss, like, where do we see 10x moments all across the board, and make it an active and open discussion between all of us, because we all like each other. I think we're going to have fun up here, and we're really here to just educate you guys on what are those types of 10x moments.
Thank you so much for that, Steve. Ben, do you want to give us a quick interlude?
Oh, okay. So, hey, guys, I'm Ben, and I always bring my melodica to panels, so. Do you have a song request? What should I play?
Cool. Can you do something by Queen?
That's all I got. That's all
Thank
I got.
you.
Okay,
Beautiful.
there we go. There we
Beautiful.
go.
So I think I want to start off this conversation with customization and customizability. When you showing that slide, Steve, of starting at like, what was it, like 60 websites ending, or like 100 websites ending at 60 billion websites, the only way that that can really happen is if we if we push complexity to the periphery. And user choice, development choice gets handed off to the margins, right? And all of a sudden, like the ease of building a website drops down very, very low, so anyone can build a website. It kind of feels like how we got there and why there's 60 billion websites out there, more websites than there are humans on this planet. Can you kind of relate that pattern to what you're seeing in the layer 3 space in this like fractal tree structure that we have no longer on screen?
Is it not? Oh. There we
that
go.
one.
Yeah, so imagine now like layer 2 is one block size fits all, and up above layer 2 is you can build a customized fractal chain blockchain for your own purposes, and you can customize it the way you want. And so think of layer 2 in terms of web speak as JavaScript. And think of what you can do up in layer above layer 2 is you have now SDKs that are for purpose-built solutions. So you might start off with an SDK that's meant for DeFi, an SDK that's meant for gaming, and so forth. But ultimately, you get to the point where you have something as easy as WordPress for the blockchain. So think of it goes for you have to be a senior engineer that knows what you're doing, and you have to know Solidity. Then we're going to go up and say, well, now you can use any language. And then we're going to go up from that and say, now you can use any SDK. And then eventually we're going to get to the point where we can get into low-code, no-code solutions for all the different use cases that exist within the blockchain space.
And we're starting to see something like this. We saw Axie Infinity produce their own sidechain, Rodin, before really they had access to some of this stuff. So we already know that there's demand for this. We see Reddit using Arbitrum's like any trust chain, which is their kind of version of the same thing. So we know there's certainly demand to do something like this. But a question to you is like, why do we have to have a layer 2 to have layer 3s? Why can't all of these many, many layer 3s that we see just go straight down to the layer 1? Why do we have to have a layer 2 in the middle?
Ben.
Because it's a bad name. Because we never should have called it an L2 in the first place, David. That's why.
What should we be calling it?
Oh, I mean, okay, so we call it superchain. That's our like hot marketing term that we use.
We have hyperchain.
You have hyperchain, right? There's
base chain.
whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I think the most important thing to understand about these systems, and like you alluded to this here, David, but the other side of customizability in this sort of long-term scaling endgame that we're all talking about here is also about like trust assumptions and basically cost security trade-offs is one way you can think about it boiling down to. So at the end of the day, it makes sense to stack these layers just from like a architectural perspective that if you have something that's less secure, you have something that's really secure, and then you have something that's cheaper, but in the middle of security, right? It makes sense to have those hierarchically be assembled in that way, right? Because if you're already making, stronger assumptions about security, which means you already have less security, if anything with more security is good to settle, so choose the cheapest, right? So I think that's part of it. And really what it means is like we should never have called this stuff L2 and L3. They're like chains, and they're all part of one cohesive thing that makes trade-offs in cost and security and that model.
Yeah, I think one way we think about it at Coinbase is we're never going to be able to bring the scale of Coinbase users onto L1. Like when you think about the architecture for L1, it's just not meant to bring hundreds of millions of users on, have them transacting with low costs. And so I think we think about L2 as kind of the place where we're going to bring all the users, and they're going to transact on a global transaction layer where, we call it the, super chain, we call it the hyper chain. Basically, it's going to be the economic infrastructure that everyone's going to be sharing. That's going to be global, it's going to be decentralized, it's going to be secured by kind of a decentralized network. And I think we think about layer 3 as kind of like the more private, more application-specific stuff that will come off of that.
So when you say Coinbase is going to drop users off, like as in like allowing withdrawals onto specific layer 2s, but you also called it like the global settlement layer. But there's many layer 2s. How can you refresh my memory?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Coinbase is not just thinking about dropping users off and kind of letting them go do their thing. We're thinking actively about how do we bring our products on chain and how do we bring experiences on chain that our customers can use. And so, for instance, our wallet product is fully decentralized, fully non-custodial, and built to be used on layer 1, layer 2, and eventually potentially layer 3. In terms of how we think about the kind of like heterogeneity of these chains. I think right now we're in this really early stage where there's a bunch of people building different L2 solutions. You have the ZK options, you have the optimistic options. I think over time, our thesis is that likely these things are going to converge towards some standard on a 3 to 5 year horizon. And it may be that there are different chains that are running on L2, but there's going to be abstractions that kind of sit over them that make it easy for users to flow across them. And maybe those are kind of cross-chain bridges, maybe those are in the user experience layer and wallet. But I think from a user experience perspective, we expect that the actual technical infrastructure of layer 2 is going to increasingly fade into the background, and increasingly what users will experience is, wow, there's this global decentralized transaction layer where I can do all the things I want to do in the economy at a sub 1 cent fee price point.
Jesse, I was going to ask you, does all of these, like this fractal tree structure where there's seemingly many chains to interact with, intimidate you in Coinbase because like, wow, there's so many places for our users to go. How are we going to access them all? But it sounds like your answer to that is more like, no, Coinbase is going to pick and choose the right ones for their users and display them to their users in an easy to manage fashion that like eliminates all the complexity and it's just one interface. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing that's like isn't really represented in this diagram is I think our thesis is that there's going to be enough commonality from a technical platform perspective between layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3 that building software products on top of those layers is going to be much easier. And so one example of this is let's say layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 all share EVM, which is kind of like the core virtual machine that powers Ethereum today. If all of those layers share that, then you can build a software product that works across all the layers much more easily than if those layers were using different virtual machines. And so I think our thesis is that we're going to see convergence at kind of the like what those layers are built with in some core primitives, which is going to make it much easier for companies like Coinbase and in general for the whole ecosystem to build experiences that seamlessly enable users to operate across all three of them.
Yeah, I was going to say, that notion that there's these shared infrastructures that we can then begin communicating with each other, I think EVM is only the beginning. As we are all, I don't think we're really competitors, we're just trying different approaches to scale Ethereum. And then as we agree, like, hey, that was a good idea, we can all then standardize on these approaches, and that makes communication tighter and more trusted as we get more mature into the system. And that if we ever had like beyond EVM agreement on how to do things, I think we get a 10x bump in trust and security between blockchains, which would be a huge bump for our ecosystem.
Yeah, and I'll give a huge shout out to Ben and the Optimism team. I mean, I think they've done really incredible work in building the kind of components of the Optimism system in an open source way that's really like oriented towards the Ethereum community, and that can be reused for other purposes and can be imbued with some of the things we're learning elsewhere. And so I think the work that they've been doing with Bedrock is going to eventually be extensible to incorporate all of the ZK stuff that Steve and his team are doing. So I think there's this like milieu that's starting to emerge where all these teams are building in the open. They're, for the most part, building open source, and they're building components in a way that they can be brought together. When we figure out the best pieces, we can say, okay, now let's stitch those together to make the thing that we had that was good even better. It's exciting.
Ben, can you go into Bedrock? What is it, and why is it so significant?
Ooh, sure. So, okay, Bedrock is like what we call the first release of like the OP stack, which is our sort of term for like basically Optimism, basically looking at all the work that we've done on scaling for the past 3 years and trying to basically bail out all the technical debt in the world and make it the most extensible, easy-to-use software imaginable. And basically, a buzzword you'll hear here is like modularity, right? What does that really mean? It really means that you should take the logical, natural abstractions that you observe in code when you're building these scaling solutions and separate them out to be easy for basically plug-and-play pieces across the stack, right? So in Bedrock, the layer for execution, where you're basically running the EVM transactions, is totally independent from the proof system where you like secure the L2 in the L1, right? And this like makes it much easier to put a ZK proof in there, for example, right? And there's lots of those examples. I think another way to say what you're saying, Jesse, which is something that we certainly believe very strongly, is basically all of the technology that we're talking about here, and one way that I even interpret this image is basically that the tech is going to be commoditized, right? Like everything here is open source, right? We're in this basically brief period of time where the people that are building that code are the ones that have massive information asymmetry, because the first time you build code, it's harder to make it easier to understand.
They're on the frontier.
They're on the frontier. They're in the Wild West, if you were, exploring, right? And eventually that's going to go away. And when that does, it's a very interesting question as to what will fall out of that. But things like customized app layers, you know, or subsections of the superchain, right? And things like this are all things that are going to fall right out of that. So Bedrock is all about building the most commoditized thing because it's going to get commoditized anyway. Let's make it as easy as possible to leverage.
I want to unpack that a little bit more. The name Bedrock makes me think of like something that's close to the metal. It also makes me think of my middle school dances, but we'll see if how many people can remember that reference.
I can make your bedrock.
So like it's very close to the metal, and like something I've heard, I think Kelvin on the Optimism team, or maybe it was you, is something like it's the theoretical minimum thing needed to produce a layer 2. And I'd like you to help me understand a little bit more what it means to commoditize all this stuff. The image I'm getting is like Bedrock is like the skeleton that is for a layer 2 or another chain, and like you can plug in your particular components of like, here's your prover, here's your whatever. Is that kind of where we're going with this?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. I mean, this is just a coding lesson that we've learned over the years, and like from many amazing mentors and just from like making mistakes, is that code minimization is incredibly, incredibly important. Like writing simple code is very important both for security and for other people to leverage it. So part of the minimal stuff that you'll hear from Kelvin is talking about that, which is about the design philosophy, which relates to modularity and things like that.
Is that what extensibility means?
It enables extensibility is one way to think about it. So if you have a bunch of pieces of the code base that are all interconnected in ways that aren't well isolated and don't have logical abstractions, then making a change in one place will have cascading effects everywhere else. So yeah, it is related, and it enables the extensibility by sort of isolating things in buckets, having as little code as possible in each bucket, and making it easier to understand based on that.
And I can attest to this about Bedrock. You know, we've been collaborating with Optimism and the Ethereum Foundation and a bunch of other folks on EIP 4844, which we should talk about. And as part of that, Coinbase has been doing an effort to kind of figure out how do we accelerate EIP 484, and as part of that, getting to figure out, okay, what does it actually look like to put a roll-up on EIP 4844? And we've been experimenting with the Bedrock code base, and I think this week we stood it up in our internal like EIP 4844 testnet in like 3 days. Like one person just kind of dug in there, figured out how it worked, deployed it on that testnet, and it was live inside of our internal systems. And I think that was just like this incredibly cool moment for us. We were like, wow, like L2, there it is.
And I want to go back to what Steve was presenting at the very beginning and where we started this conversation, which was that chart which we started at like 100 websites and ended at 60 billion. And I think this is what we're really talking about. We're talking about the bedrock infrastructure that's needed to enable other people to produce their layer 2 flavor of choice. There's going to be an infinite number of flavors of layer 2s in the same way there's an infinite number of websites out there. But we're talking about the bedrock of that scaffolding, right? Like the bare minimum needed to do what Jesse just said, which is spin up a layer 2 inside of 3 days. And like we're still, like it's a meme in the space, we're still so early. I would imagine 3 days gets compressed to much less and less amount of time as we move forward. I do want to bring up the conversation of bridges, though, because bridges are an important discussion here. And Steve, you also talked about that little like a shield in the browser corner of like, oh yeah, this website's secure, you can totally pay money on it. I think it's a fair metaphor to extend here, and I want you to check me on this, that the bridges between, like, on this, like, fractal thing that we saw where there's all these different lines, thank you for going back and forth, all these different lines between all these different chains, like, that's a bridge. There's a bridge there. And, like, in the last, like, 18 months, like, the word bridge has, like, triggered some amount of PTSD. Can you talk about why these bridges are different and, like, what the new shield icon might indicate in the future world?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the simplest form, imagine that in your browser, you don't see the lock icon in the top left, you see the Ethereum icon in the top left, and you're like, everything that transacts over the internet forever is just on Ethereum. One of the unique sort of like properties of how we are doing the fractal hyperchains up in layer 3 is that normally when you have one blockchain talking to another blockchain, you have a non-native bridge, and that is the weakness, that's the hack point. One of the properties that we have been able to, I would say hypothesize, because we're not there yet, is that all of these bridges between the fractal hyperchains, a huge innovation is that they can be native. And this is one of those 10x moments in security. So everybody in the audience, I know that if you felt a 10x more trust in crypto, you know that the use cases and the users would come. And there's many more inventions than just that is going to improve security. But if we can knock down these things, like bridges has just been a huge thing. It's similar to like when we finally let people understand that they can trust their credit cards on the internet. This is an extremely similar sort of mirrored moment for crypto.
Yeah, and I think I give a huge shout out to Steve and his team for the research they're doing right now on ZK bridges. I think that there is something potentially really powerful, because if you can get the ZK bridge mechanism set up for this L1 to L2 and then the L2 to L3, it means that, and Ben can share more about this, some of the finality challenges we have right now with rollups, where it can take a long time to move from one chain to another, you can make that much faster. And that means that rather than having to take 7 days to move from L2 to L1, it can be almost instant. And I think we're not quite there yet. We haven't figured out exactly what that actually looks like, but the research that ZK Sync is doing, the research that the EF is doing around kind of how do we make those ZK bridges really work is going to be what's going to enable that seamless kind of movement across chains.
And imagine a world, when we talked about standards like EVM and other things, imagine that the ZK Sync prover becomes like the standardized prover of choice, but now it's in Bedrock, it's now everywhere, and now you can go from Optimism to ZK Sync on a native bridge because we're sharing one circuit. Those are the advantages of agreeing to standards. Those are advantages of being mission-driven and saying we are not competitors. We are all here for one mission to make Ethereum scale. And it's so wrongly reported that we are competitors that go each other. We just have a lot of fun on stage. But we are always thinking, how can we make advancements? And like they do Bedrock, we do the prover. Like they do something, we do something else. Coinbase does something. And we're all sitting there saying, how do these components eventually mesh together? And we are looking for opportunities for agreement and standards. And when we find them, that's those 10x moments. And like if that ever happened, like we could bridge over with Optimism to us and back, and it's a pure native bridge, like that's your security icon up in the top left of your browser moment.
At Bankless, we often get criticized for being like ETH maxis, and I think a lot of that nuance is lost when we talk about like all of these cross layer 1 bridges that we see have gotten hacked so many times. And if I had my free will, which are my own brand, which I don't, I would be called like a security maxi or a decentralization maxi, because that is what this whole entire industry is built off of. So you could imagine like maybe perhaps over here we have Avalanche, and maybe perhaps over there we have Solana, and like maybe towards the center we have Ethereum, but those all become non-native bridges. And so that bridge actually becomes an intermediary, which is kind of the thing that we're trying to get rid of in this industry. And so when Steve and Ben, they're all talking about, oh, we have this same standards, this same substrate, it becomes a native bridge. And so that native bridge is a cryptographic bridge, not a multi-sig that is hosted on AWS that could get hacked or exploited. It's actually reducing an entire middleman out of that. And so when we talk about that SSL security lock shield, it's the same corollary of like, this is safe. There's not an intermediary here. You have that security.
And one of the paradigm shifts that happens when you realize that if everybody's on the same circuit, everybody gets a native bridge. Think of all the alt L1s that are not Ethereum that are saying, hey, I want to get more tied into Ethereum. They all have non-native bridges to Ethereum now. If they actually move up into layer 3 as a layer 3 Validium with one circuit, those alt L1s now have a native bridge back to Ethereum as a layer 3 Validium. And that's sort of like semi-unexpected moment, at least for me, not by Marco sitting there. He's the one that came up with all this. But like these are like exciting moments when we're like, ooh, we could do that. And like those types of moments are like what I live for. I know I don't want to speak for you guys, but those are the days I'm like, all right, I have enough energy to go for 10 more years now. That's amazing when those moments happen.
Ben, do you have something?
Yeah. Okay. So totally agreed. Solana should be an L2. Don't get me started on that. Don't get me started on that one. I do want to say something though about how we think about bridges and how early we are and the implications that I think that has on how we think about these things. And I think it's great to think of. I love the little like SSL green lock, cert icon analogy when we're talking about this. And I think another way to think about I think if I were an audience member, I might think like WTF is a native bridge, right? And I think, honestly, the way that I think about it is a native bridge is a bridge that allows you to not think about it as bridging, right?
Yes.
And like when you imagine the explosion of 60 billion websites in Web 2, right? Like maybe very early on we talked about all of the hyperlinks or whatever that was going to be going on behind the scenes. The reality is that the security is going to become about the applications that you are using. And like,
right.
So it's interesting to we think about bridge security today. I think about native bridging as a way to make people stop thinking about that, both from a UX perspective, but also from a security perspective. It's the application that chooses its security. And like behind the scenes, bridging happens if you cross security boundaries. Yeah. But it's not this front and center thing. In 10 years' time, you're not going to be thinking, oh, I want to use this app. It's on a different chain. Let me go and go to my bridge and bridge over and wait for it to happen. I'm just going to navigate to the website for that application, and my wallet or whatever is going to help me just move my funds there, and I won't even know that it's going on. But if the app is less secure, I'll be warned, right? So I think that's how to think about it.
100%. And these are the experiences we're already trying to build into the Coinbase products, where increasingly the bridge experience is behind the scenes, particularly for native bridges, where we feel confident that we can actually abstract that from customers, and it's not going to put them at risk.
Yeah, it won't be a conversation, I don't know, 1 or 2 years from now. We'll just have it's HTTP, HTTPS, HTTPE, and then we don't even talk about bridges anymore. It connects, it resolves, we trust it. It doesn't exist as a problem. It's something we look back on and laugh, and we're like, ha ha ha. Those $500 million bridges, all that hacking is like, thank God that's past us.
Jesse, you wanted to talk about EIP 4844, and we only have a minute and a half left. Why should people care about 4844? Why is it such a big deal? What should we know about it?
Yeah, EIP 4844 is an upgrade to the Ethereum network that's going to increase the amount of capacity that rollups have to roll up to Ethereum. And what that means is that the cost of rollup is going to drop significantly. We're currently projecting something like a 10x to 100x decrease. And so that means that whereas fees on Optimism or ZK Sync today might be something like 5 to 50 cents, we're hoping that we can get those down to half a cent or to 5 cents. And for customers all over the world, that is a huge, huge change in user experience. Maybe not for people in this room, but for the average person, if you're having to pay 50 cents for a given send versus having to pay a half a cent, that's going to totally change the way you can use crypto. And so we're currently working to try and get EIP 4844 landed in the next Ethereum hard fork, which is Shanghai, which would be Q1, Q2. There's a lot of work that's happening behind the scenes to make that happen. Optimism is working on it. Coinbase is working on it. ZK Sync is starting to contribute. The Ethereum Foundation. It's really the next key scaling milestone for Ethereum, and I think we need the whole community to rally around it and make sure it gets done.
The 2021 bull market occurred in the app layer, right? It was like DeFi summer, NFTs, but it was built on the Ethereum layer 1, the Ethereum protocol that had iteration and iteration on it throughout 2019 and 2020. And so the patterns I've seen is that first it's an app layer bull market, and then a bunch of spin-offs try and compete for that, right? So like DeFi summer, NFT season, boom, we have Solana and Avalanche trying to do the same thing. First it starts in the Ethereum app layer, then it goes on to another alternative protocol. Then it goes into the protocol system, but they're offshoots. My kind of vision for the next bull market, I don't have a question here, is that it starts on the layer 2s, and finally the cheap fees open up the bandwidth to a bunch of new use cases. And maybe after this goddamn bear market, people figure it out, the retail comes back, we adopt applications on the layer 2s, and all of a sudden that creates a flourishing of applications as to why people want to be there in the first place, and this layer 2 thesis can be borne out because of the expressivity that we've been talking about here on this panel. So,
100%, it's coming.
thank you so much for helping me understand why both layer 2s and layer 3s are super cool.
So cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, y'all.
Awesome.